You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 383 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Very excited to have Will Porter back on the show today. This is his 50-something appearance of the, on the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. He is now a staff writer at RT. Of course, he's, written many places during his appearances on this show. Consortium News, Antiwar.com, Libertarian Institute, The Daily Sheeple, always doing great work. Now, Will is super busy putting out, I would say, close to 20 articles every week on various topics, but you can always find them on his Facebook page and on his Twitter. The Twitter is at WKPANCAP. The Facebook page is Will Porter, which, if you're looking through the profile pictures, it's the dude with the mustache. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back on, Kyle. Always glad to come back on.
Yeah, well, I think I got a good list for you today. And it's been a while since we've done a show like this. I've definitely ran episodes with you on the show, but I think they've mostly either been interviews with like another guest, Mike Meharry, or Joanne interviewed us and I ran that, and then Stephen Clyde interviewed us and I ran that. So it's good to have you, actually back on guest of the show talking about the news here with me playing the host. Makes an easy job for me. Everybody, please take the time to share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. Easiest place to find it. I'm in the right-hand column with the daily news roundup and foreign policy focus. Put me and Will out there to people so they get exposed to our work. All right, Will, we got Afghanistan first on the list today. One of the big news stories from the past week coming from Afghanistan, because there have been actually quite a few big news stories from Afghanistan this week, was that 2 U.S. soldiers were killed there. It turns out it's a green on blue insider attack where a member of the Afghan security forces was apparently actually a Taliban fighter, turns his gun on and shoots, I believe, 3 Americans, 2 were killed, 1 was injured. Just another tragedy in this very long, very unnecessary war. Will, I don't know if you want to weigh in on, this attack in particular, or just kind of the damage done by these insider attacks.
Yeah, it is kind of insane that, 20 years later, we are still seeing this same kind of thing happening. You see these green on blue attacks all the time, which is where a supposed ally, one of our allied forces turns and attacks, an American. That's sort of what green on blue means. But yeah, I'm not sure how much commentary I have on this most recent attack, other than, of course, it's a tragic, terrible story. But yeah, it's sad to see that there's still this much violence going on in the country 20 years down the line.
Well, that is an interesting part of it too, is that there hasn't been a whole lot of commentary on this. There's not a lot of reporting done, under Trump in particular, but, this was, tied up under Bush too. They don't report a whole lot about the deaths. It's not like the military is coming out. Nobody, at least not frequently, they don't do like long profiles of these people like in the New York Times or Washington Post. What mission were they serving? What were they doing when they were killed? Who were they training? How, did this Taliban insider, get into the Afghan army? This is something that, really shouldn't happen. Why weren't the Guardian Angels, the American snipers positioned to guard the U.S. forces able to respond more quickly and maybe save the lives of at least one of these soldiers? So, there's an awful lot of reporting that could be done here that's not done by anyone. And I guess, that is kind of part of how this war ends up going on for 18 years. I also guess just want to mention that, these green on blue attacks are extremely damaging to the U.S. mission. And I think are kind of long known as very useful insurgency tactics, not only by the Taliban, but just by different groups that, you could infiltrate yourself within, the security forces they're supposed to be training. It undermines all the trust. Is very problematic. So let's look at some of the other headlines from Afghanistan this week, including progress seeming to be made between talks between the U.S. and the Taliban and a potential peace agreement, which makes, the death of these American soldiers all the more, really futile. But Will, why don't you get into a little bit the status of the peace talks there?
Yeah, sure. And so, yeah, this is sort of more like the angle I'm thinking in terms of Afghanistan this week. Because the violence is horrible, the attacks are horrible. However, I think we're seeing other more significant things sort of on the front of progress here that we haven't seen, at all in the last 20 years, 18 years. And so just recently, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, came out and explicitly said that Trump wants to wind down the presence not only in Afghanistan, but across the board. And so it sounds like Trump is really giving it to Pompeo, telling him this. A part of what Pompeo said, quoting from his comments, was that the president has been unambiguous. End the endless wars, draw down, reduce. And he said it won't just be us. And so Pompeo said that is a directive the president has given him. And I guess we've heard sort of some of this lip service before to drawing down and pulling back and stuff, but it just seems like he's given this as a directive very explicitly. So I think that's sort of a good sign. You do, of course, have officials, like in that same report, I think it broke in Reuters, of Pompeo saying this. You did have some officials, both Americans and Afghans, sort of attacking the idea of a pullout. But I guess that's to be expected. This war's gone on for so long that there's a lot of vested interests created here. I think there's genuine worries in Kabul that the Taliban will come and take over again or something, or set up shop and cause a lot of trouble. And so I think there's probably some legitimate concerns about that. However, I think that's mostly been used as sort of an excuse to stay forever. And so it seems like hopefully the arguments in favor of a withdrawal or a reduction at least are sort of winning or prevailing. And
it seems kind of obvious here too that the Afghan government is artificially overpowered because of the backing by the United States. And so just like a U.S. company looking to renew its contract with the Pentagon, it's just, self-interest and power. There's no reason not to fully expect that this is what, the Afghan government is going to do, lobby for the U.S. government to continue to support them. One of the criticisms by the U.S. official I found particularly stupid, which was saying that all this talk about the U.S. leaving Afghanistan would embolden the Taliban.
I mean, yeah, it's just like, how long can you keep using this argument? I don't know. Like, it's just like 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line, that like, if we leave, they might like it. It's like, yeah, but the status quo is unsustainable. It's unworkable. And so something has to happen. Like, you can't just keep saying this over and over again that, oh, they sure would like it if we left. I mean, of course they would. They want us to leave. We're a foreign occupier of their country. Now, I guess like more in terms of the actual talks themselves, like with the Taliban, just recently, I think it was just on Wednesday that you had the special envoy to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad. He came out and said that the latest round of talks and negotiations was the most productive ones yet. That like since he was appointed as a special envoy last year, I think he said this is the best like round of talks that we've had so far. And so like I don't want to be overly hopeful about it, but it seems like that's a good sign that as things go on, it seems like there's more to be optimistic about. It's not like they made this effort. They declared that they were going to have peace in Afghanistan. And then as time's gone on, it's gotten less and less likely and more complicated. It does seem like there is some progress here. It does seem like, Zalmay Khalilzad, despite his history as quite a hawkish guy and kind of a neocon, it does seem like he means business here and that he actually wants to make this happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the real signs for me of that is that the Taliban have remained in the talks this whole time. The Taliban have been, I think, pretty hardlined overall in their stance that, their position is that the Americans have to leave, and once the Americans leave, then, they can negotiate peace. They recently did say that once the announcement is made, they'll start talking with the Afghan government. So that sounded like, good news to me, because I'm sure there's strategic withdrawals that could happen that would prevent slaughters of people, possibly on both sides of this thing should the U.S. just withdraw without, any kind of deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And so maybe, some kind of political solution can be reached to that. But, what you really need is for the Americans to leave. It's also, just one of the reasons why I led off today talking about that the 2 U.S. soldiers dying is a reminder that this war is not cost free for the Americans. Our young men will continue to die in Afghanistan if we choose to stay. And so, you have to look at that U.S. official who says, oh, it emboldens the Taliban to stay. We'll say, yeah, but that also means that you're going to kill 2 Americans every, month or two? Is that really what you're willing to do? Certainly this guy wouldn't put the, gun to the American's head and shoot him, but that's essentially what he's doing by making this argument and forcing them to stay in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's right. It's totally true. It's an unworkable status quo, or it's at least a very costly one that I don't think most Americans want to continue to, have to shell out for. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been a total sticking point with the Taliban that they're not gonna budge on much of anything until we agree to leave. And so that is sort of like the bottom line, that we have to figure out that first.
Right. And there's so much financial corruption going on too. I just read a story this week about how the U.S. was trying to build some kind of security compound in Afghanistan. Knew it wasn't going to work in like 2017, but continued the contract and, push the data completion back years and years and years. So finally, it's not even going to be completed till 2023. We've already sunk $100 million into it, never have done anything with it. And finally, they decide to cancel the contract at the Pentagon, but wasted $100 million of American, taxpayer money for nothing. Hey, well, can you imagine if they just gave us like 1% of that? How much that would like change our lives and mean for us? And they completely wasted it in Afghanistan.
Yeah. I mean, entire years' salaries of, people like us are blown away in seconds with these kind of things. A single JDAM bomb is like a good chunk of my salary, yearly. But yeah, not to mention these insane boondoggles and these construction projects. There was one thing I covered a couple of years ago in Afghanistan where they allowed this Afghan commander to pick out the type of camouflage the National Army would get. And he picked something that it's like a forest green camouflage. They wasted millions of dollars on this. And some of the military experts decided that it would actually make them less safe, that it would make them stand out like a sore green thumb. It's not camouflage. And so, yeah, just, millions of dollars blown on these kind of decisions. And it's insane. How many years' salaries is that combined,
Well, I'm, I guess, optimistic in August here that something may happen between the U.S. and the Taliban. I know about a month or two ago, Pompeo said they were looking for a month deadline. I know Khalilzad said that he thinks that something may be finalized in this upcoming talks. Now, that may not be a public announcement, but, maybe behind the scenes, he's gone back, talked to his bosses, gotten the approval for everything, and can now come to the table and say, yeah, we could agree to this kind of timeline. I guess, the last thing I want to mention, Will, and just to get your thoughts on it, I'm really concerned that the timeline is going to be too long here, and that, while there are probably some people in the Democratic field like, Gabbard, Sanders, and even Elizabeth Warren, and who knows, maybe even Gillibrand could be thrown in there, may not actually, oppose Donald Trump's effort to withdraw from Afghanistan. But you want to look at like kind of that consensus middle, Biden, Booker, Kamala Harris. I think what you'll find is that they would oppose this policy, just like Trump did with Obama's Iran nuclear deal, because it's Trump's. And probably they're committed to the war. Well, at least in Biden's case, they are. And so I'm worried that if the pullout takes past the 2020 election cycle and, is like a 5-year withdrawal, it's just going to be undone before the end. And we're going to end up in a bigger mess than we already are now.
Yeah, look at what happened with Syria. I think we kind of learned this the hard way. We both were kind of overly optimistic, I think. At least I was, definitely, about the Syria withdrawal or drawdown. And they've managed to slow roll that to where it's like, it seems like nothing's really happening there. And so I shared your concern there about a timetable that's drawn out for too long creates it's too much opportunity and chance to reverse stuff and undo this.
All right. Well, I want to spend the meat of the show talking today about Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence. Now, this guy is nominated, so he will have to pass the Senate, but he is a current congressman, and so I think there's some, leeway given to your colleagues, at least in the Senate is like senators always confirm fellow senators. It's kind of this ridiculous club clique they all have. But so, this guy, I imagine right now it looks like the path he's on is to get confirmed. His name is Ratcliffe, and Will, I will just kind of let you talk all about him because I know you've read very extensively on this guy.
Yeah, sure. So there is some interesting stuff about this Ratcliffe guy in terms of his ties to the military-industrial complex. There's some pretty funny and interesting stuff about his exaggerated claims about his own career as a federal prosecutor. He's made some very overblown claims about what he's done in his career. However, I think maybe the most significant thing for us in terms of our interests the interest of the show, is that Ratcliffe is saying that he wants to dig into the origins of the Russiagate investigation and like the origins of the whole Trump-Russia thing. And it sounds like he might mean it. I mean, he said things like, he thinks the Obama administration has invented this whole Trump-Russia line and that they, quote, reverse engineered evidence to fit it. That kind of sounds like something we might say or we might suggest. I think in a recent interview on TV too with Bartiromo, he called some people out by name. He even said the former FBI director James Comey, Bruce Orr, who was he was a high up DOJ official, and Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS, the company that's behind the whole Steele dossier. He said all these people, he called them out by name and said they've maybe broken the law in some way and they need to be investigated. And so that certainly bodes well in my mind for someone who's trying to look into sort of dig into the origins of the Russiagate thing. And I think he also named, or he didn't name them. He just mentioned that there were other Obama administration officials who probably are in on this. And I think we can kind of maybe guess who he's talking about. Someone like John Brennan. And actually, I saw Brennan the other day tweeting, basically talking Ratcliffe, saying a lot of bad things about him, saying that he's subservient to Trump and that he rejects the Mueller claim. And so yeah, I think he's sort of. Ratcliffe is positioning himself to be an enemy of these people, of the Russiagators. However, the only problem here is that this is the guy who Trump has nominated for the director of national intelligence. But the only problem is I'm not totally sure that he's going to be able to do a whole lot on the Russiagate front from that position. And so maybe we can get into what the DNI is. So the DNI was created by Bush Jr. It's a fairly recent innovation. It was created just I think 2005. It was after the 9/11 attacks, after the massive intelligence failures that, partially led to those attacks. So it used to be the case that, the head of the CIA was also what's called the Director of Central Intelligence, or the DCI, meaning the same guy ran the CIA and also oversaw the whole intelligence community, all 17 agencies or whatever, all at the same time. And so Bush Jr. did away with that arrangement. He sort of decoupled those positions. He replaced the DCI with the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, and now it has to be two separate people. And so that's the job that Ratcliffe is now up for. However, the problem here is that the DNI doesn't really have that much authority. His main role is to produce the president's daily intelligence brief, and that's pretty much it. That's the role of the DNI, is to go between all the intelligence agencies and gather up the information for that daily brief. Now the DNI used to have powers to declassify certain stuff, but that recently changed, and I'll get into that in a second. So what someone that we admire and look up to, Ray McGovern, the way he's sort of describing what Ratcliffe could do in this position, he says he can act as a deputy sheriff sort of to the Attorney General, to Bill Barr, in sort of going after this Russiagate stuff. However, that sort of leaves it up to Barr. That puts everything in his hands, and it's not totally clear that Barr is actually going to go after this stuff. I don't know if Barr has come out quite as harshly as Ratcliffe has in terms of how bad he wants to pursue this. And I don't think that's really clear about the other investigators who've been put on this case either. You have Michael Horowitz, you have John Durham, and there was even another guy, John Huber, who we haven't heard from in months, but he was supposed to be another guy investigating this. And I think a lot of people, including myself, maybe you too, Kyle, I'm kind of worried that this whole investigating the investigators thing is going to end up covering up more than it reveals. Some of these guys, like Barr, like Durham, are pretty tied into the deep state, what we would call the deep state, the intelligence agencies, the DOJ, some of the most powerful and abusive agencies of our government. And so these guys might have some loyalties that pre-exist this. And so the point being, Ratcliffe might be good on some of this Russiagate stuff, but I'm not sure he's going to have the authorities to pursue it. And he might have to sort of take a back seat to people like Barr, who might not have the same motivation. Now, in terms of declassification, the power to declassify material related to the 2016 election and the FBI investigation and Crossfire Hurricane and all that stuff, that power was actually just transferred from the DNI to the Attorney General. And so basically the President Trump, by signing this presidential memorandum in May, he basically stripped the DNI of any power to declassify stuff related to Russiagate. So even if Ratcliffe is nominated for this position, he's not going to be able to really do this on his own. He's not going to be able to pursue it unilaterally. And so really it's going to he really might have to be a deputy sheriff to Barr, as McGovern put it, with the emphasis on deputy. And so I think the main point here is that this all pretty much relies on Barr now. like, as good as Ratcliffe might be on this question, we're sort of like in the hands of the Attorney General now, which I think is sort of unfortunate. I don't know if that bodes well for this really being, exposed and investigated.
Yeah, I mean, Barr seems like more of a company man than Ratcliffe to me, so it does seem that if he is taking on that deputy sheriff role, then maybe Ray McGovern is a little bit over optimistic about what Ratcliffe is actually going to do. He does, I think really believe that this was a setup, and I think in part we saw that in the Mueller hearings, and Will, I'm going to let you talk about that in a minute. But at the same time, I guess, just on your analysis of the position and what powers it has, so much of it, especially the way the U.S. government and executive power work now, I think it's just you kind of have the powers that the president allows you to have. And so if he just goes out and starts, taking some actions on Russiagate here, then, and especially if Donald Trump wants him to, who's going to stop him? And I suppose if the only reason Donald Trump maybe signed that memorandum to give Barr the power, I guess he could give it back to Ratcliffe as well. I'm not sure on how all that works, but it seems like if Trump could just distribute it out. And we do know that Ratcliffe's predecessor, Dan Coates, was not good on Russiagate. This guy, was one of the kooky Russia conspiracists saying that Russia had the election and everything. So, Donald Trump is replacing somebody better that way. I also, and I'm just going to throw this in here, in all the mainstream media coverage of this guy, they say his positions don't ally with Dan Coates on North Korea and Russiagate, which means that he's good on North Korea and Russiagate because Dan Coates wasn't. And so maybe there's a little bit of reason for some more optimism with North Korea as well, as we hopefully have some thoughts, brewing there.
Right. And yeah, in terms of like the shifting around of authorities and stuff, I agree. I think that like easy come, easy go sort of. Trump signed this presidential memorandum to give that declassification power to Barr. And I suspect that probably had something to do with the current, or I guess now previous DNI, Dan Coates, than it does with, the incumbent one or the incoming one. But yeah, I mean, Trump could just as easily sign another presidential memorandum. I think the authority to declassify material was initially given to the DNI by an executive order anyway. So really, yeah, like they have a lot of leeway here to do what they want. So hopefully that, hopefully things don't shape up quite as I was saying, that, Barr becomes a obstructionist and Ratcliffe is sort of powerless.
Yeah, you brought up the Durham investigation there, and I picked up on an important fact in that in Ray McGovern's article. And all these articles on Ratcliffe will be linked in the show notes page. I got them all ready to go. But what McGovern points out is that Durham was actually involved in the Obama-era investigation of the Bush administration's torture program and seemed, I guess, to be helpful in towing the company line perfectly by generally condemning the torture program and saying that it was bad, but at the same time not holding anybody accountable. And McGovern chalks this up to Durham being, I guess, like kind of a company man. And so if his orders are to find corruption, then maybe he finds corruption. And if his orders are to cover it up, he'll cover it up. So and maybe, Ray, I think, looks at it as a little bit of a reason to be optimistic. I didn't take it quite so much that way. I thought, ooh, well, this could be bad if, suddenly people get cold feet. And it turns out that this conspiracy is either really big, really bad, or just, not something that Trump wants to get into with all the political pressures he has to shut it down from within the deep state in his administration. So it does.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Like with Durham, I think it largely comes down to like, if he's a company man, well, what company is he working for? Does he consider himself part of the establishment, deep state, or what, however you want to describe that? Or does he actually see himself as working for the president? That would sort of, I think that would determine sort of how he's going to approach this.
Now, there was a Truth Out article that you sent me going over some of Ratcliffe's monetary allegiances. And so do you want to get into a little bit of who owns this representative?
Yeah, sure. And maybe we should include too, like Ratcliffe, this guy's not a nobody in the House. He's on 3 committees. He's on Homeland Security, Intelligence, and Judiciary. So like this guy has some sway, it seems. And this guy is backed up. I think Truth Out described him as a favorite of the defense industry, or the arms industry, let's say. Defense is a euphemism.
Yeah, can I just want to go into real quick because you said, and he is a relatively new congressman, which suggests that he has a lot of sway somehow because, as we know, those committees are pay to play. You got to fundraise money for the party to get on those committees.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You don't just get put on those things with no backing or support, or like, just by your ideas or something. Like, you get there by being bankrolled by Northrop Grumman. And that is precisely what has, happened with Ratcliffe. I think he's taken in like $100,000 in the last, I think, 2 years, from the so-called defense industry. And so I guess, like, putting that into perspective, that might, or I guess, I don't know. I'm not actually sure the average contribution to a congressman from the arms industry. However, just by comparison, if you look at some of his other stuff, like, there is some counterpoint here. Ratcliffe's gotten like double the amount of contributions from the electronics sector, the non-military electronics sector, at least I think. And then also I think he's gotten like the vast majority of his contributions from like ideological conservative groups, because Ratcliffe is considered to be this like uber conservative guy. But also, as I said off air, some of those conservative groups very well, a lot of these think tanks and political groups are bankrolled by the arms industry. And so it could just be this, indirect kind of thing in that case.
That you saying that brings an interesting point from a Daniel Larison article that we also read on this. So again, there's all these articles in the show notes page, and I'll say, and I think will agree, that a lot of these articles kind of seem to contradict, their overall opinion of Ratcliffe. Some have a more positive take on Larison's. I think was probably the most negative of all these articles. But basically, he kind of lays out that this is a very Republican district. It's one of the most Republican districts in the entire country. At one, I think he ran unopposed in a primary and then beat a libertarian candidate with like 84% of the vote. He ran unopposed in the primary and then beat a Democratic candidate with like 75% of the vote. And so it seems like he's fundraising an awful lot of money, but doesn't really have a challenge. I don't know. I guess I find that to be interesting. Maybe that explains the committee appointments.
Right. And I guess maybe one thing to mention here, you brought up that Daniel Larison article. I think Daniel's main point is that Ratcliffe is not qualified, that he's supposed to have some kind of intelligence and legal expertise and qualification, and apparently he doesn't. And that's what I was referring to earlier about him making stuff up about his career as a prosecutor. I think it's on his website or something, but he claims that he was part of this high-profile, the Holy Land case against Hamas, and that he somehow prosecuted this case. But it turns out really he was on some small, insignificant little chunk of it, and he had nothing to do with actually prosecuting it. And so he's like definitely overstated his credentials there. And that is what Larison sort of is. He's saying that he might not get confirmed, I think, because of his lack of credentials. I believe that's what Larison wrote.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting. In one sense, as a libertarian, I don't care. It seems like sometimes, like, maybe if the person's more unqualified, they would be better, because when you get the qualified people, they do a pretty terrible job, and seem to conspire to, for those terrible ends. And so if the guy's, the director of national intelligence is incapable of doing his job, I don't know if that's a bad thing necessarily. So I guess I did agree with, Larison just on that one kind of aspect of it. And at the same time, too, this is a made-up position with made-up authorities that, was just recently created. And so, what is being qualified anyways? Maybe the guy gets on antiwar.com every morning and reads, and we just don't know. That would make you more qualified to, run the DNI than anything else would possibly be, whether it's working for the CIA or committee appointments. And it also, I guess that was the other thing I was thinking, is that if this guy doesn't maybe have an extensive background in the intelligence agency, he would be more likely to go after. I know there's a real fraternal community amongst the intelligence agencies, maybe not as a collective, but the CIA, the FBI, NSA.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe this is a good place to switch over into some of the other Russiagate stuff. I've been covering this as it came up on the show, Will, but it's been a while since we sat down and talked to have a show like this. And so there's been a lot going on in the whole Russiagate investigation that I want to give you the opportunity to weigh in on, because, we've talked about so much on the show, and you have a great perspective, of people who have covered Russiagate and followed Russiagate. You certainly are, one of the most knowledgeable people out there. So we had Mueller's big testimony and hearing, and this was, I think, supposed to be the giant gotcha moment, right? Where they were going to say what was said in the report and that Trump needs to be impeached. What'd you think about it, Will?
Yeah, this was supposed to be the big moment where it's how many times did people in media and Democrats and stuff say, you just wait until we have Mueller testify. That's when he's really going to show you and prove all this to be true. However, I don't think the hearings, not much new came out in those hearings at all. Mueller, repeatedly kept referring to his own report and was, of course, extremely unwilling to answer a lot of questions and evaded a lot. And in fact, I think that's one of the major takeaways I had from the hearings, from what I saw. I admittedly did not watch them. I think there were two. I did not watch them back to back, but I saw a lot of the highlights and clips and stuff. Now, one thing I noticed, though, is that Mueller was very clearly being extra evasive about certain types of questions. Certain questions that, based on what we know, would lead to some pretty tricky questions for Mueller. Like Joseph Mifsud. He was asked about that. It was extremely evasive. There was one part I think it was in the first hearing, though, where Mueller straight up tried to tell one of the congressmen that he couldn't answer a certain question. I forget what it was even about specifically. It doesn't really even matter. But as the congressman soon informed him, the answer to the question was in his own report. And so I want to know, how many times did Mueller act like he couldn't answer a question because of some rule or regulation or law when he obviously could? Clearly within the case of the thing in the report, he could have answered that. It's public. It's in his own report. So I just find that interesting. I wonder there, too, if he was being sort of intentionally evasive, which I think is probably more likely, or if he's actually unaware, if he doesn't have a full command over what's in his own report. Because we did have a moment of the hearing where somebody tried to ask him about Fusion GPS, the opposition research firm that was behind
this is
the Steele
fantastic.
dossier. Yeah, and he did not know what it was. He was unfamiliar with what this institution is. And it's amazing that people like us, I guess we are pretty savvy. We're pretty intensely, familiar with a lot of these stories and stuff. But I think even people who are less, news junkies know what Fusion GPS is, and they're aware of some of these basic facts. And it was incredible to me that he couldn't answer that. He couldn't get into that. I don't know. That's amazing that this is such a basic thing. The company that commissioned the Steele dossier, which was one of the major things that led to this expanding into such a big investigation, such a big controversy. Mueller can't even explain what that is. However, there's a comedian actually I listened to named Robbie Bernstein. He's on a podcast I like called Part of the Problem. He had a great idea for how you could hold people's feet to the fire in hearings like this. He suggested that you should have a panel of intelligence and legal experts and stuff who on the spot who referee these questions. So when Mueller says, "Oh, I can't answer that," they immediately put it to the panel and the panel decides. I think that would be a great way. That might drag out the hearing a little bit, but I think that would be an awesome way to try to hold the feet to the fire. Because I think this is such a common thing with these hearings is the officials don't have to answer anything. They can evade whatever they want. They can make it up and just say, "Oh, it's not legal for me to answer that. I can't get into that." Whereas if you had some authority right there on the spot to say, "No, yes, you can. Now answer, Mr. Mueller," I think that would be helpful.
I guess it would be helpful if there was accountability too. If James Clapper was, held for perjury after he lied and said that there wasn't a mass spying program, which Edward Snowden later revealed that there was, that may make a little bit of a difference and the officials may care a little bit more too. I think you're kind of caught up in the same, split that I am with the whole, Mueller testimony where you had Dan McAdams point out pretty quickly that he, this could be, just an evasive tactic, pretending like he doesn't know. Honestly, it came off to me if you just take what I saw at face value, which is the other interpretation, that Mueller's checked out, that he really wasn't all that involved with this investigation, that he's overwhelmed by it. He really doesn't understand it. And maybe it's just, I think a 72-year-old man, maybe, declining mental facilities mean that he's really not prepared for the hearing. That's the other take, or that, he was doing it to be evasive because this report was just such a piece of crap and the whole Russiagate thing is so terrible that he had to walk this very careful fence, which he actually can't do, where at one point he has to kind of give lip service to the, Trump bad narrative. He has to not say anything that's false and also cover for the intelligence agencies like the FBI that, he's a huge fan of. And again, this fraternal FBI bond kind of thing wants to cover up for when they, illegally investigate the Trump administration.
Yeah, man. In terms of his mental facilities, honestly, I noticed that too. He seemed lost in a lot of these, during a lot of this questioning, he's like, what page is it on? What volume? what now? What's fusion GPS? He seemed to, like you said, be kind of checked out. And
You know,
I guess
looked like
go ahead.
he looked like a student who didn't read a book trying to answer a teacher's questions about it.
Right, he just read the Cliff Notes or something.
Right, like, you know, he doesn't know who, like, minor characters are, his dates are all blurry, you know, can't really find things there. He's like, I think, you know, I don't know about that, I don't think I can answer that. So there's just so much of that going on that was kind of like, you know, one of the takeaways from it. Now, maybe that's intentional and that's what he was trying to do. But I did want to just kind of move into, you know, the takeaway from this, I think from a lot of people was like, ooh, like it did not look good for the Russiagate, you know, conspiracy theorist.
No, I think it was sort of like, I saw some people describing it as a disaster, and it, I think kind of was. Like, the expectations that the, you know, to use a buzzword, the liberal media had us, you know, thinking about in terms of the Mueller hearing was that this guy was going to be so sharp. He's going to go in there and just like, you know, smash the hammer of justice and really stick it to Trump and come out with these very definitive conclusions and, you know, clarifying things in the report. And that is not at all what happened. Like, nothing really new came out of this. And if anything, I think there was some embarrassing moments, like we're talking about the fusion GPS thing. And then also clearly just some like, just moments of weakness where you could see where like one of these congressmen is pushing him on Joseph Mifsud or something. And you could see him getting a little hot under the collar and saying like, I can't answer that. I can't answer that. So I just think that sort of like sharpened some of the contradictions, you might say. It sort of showed that like maybe this thing is not quite what the, you know, what the Russiagate people have been saying. Maybe it's not quite as ironclad, and this, you know, heroic Mueller guy is not the, you know, not the hero you thought he was.
I think there's another big, you know, kind of swing taken out of that recently, Will, that I haven't talked to you about. And that is in the Internet Research Agency trial, where you have this, you know, company that was somehow wrapped up in the Internet Research Agency indictments that Mueller handed out, Concord Management. And so, you know, these people hired lawyers and showed up to court. And I don't think Mueller expected that to happen, but then, you know, they requested discovery and are saying that, hey, you're alleging that our company was tied to, you know, this grand conspiracy to let Donald Trump. We want to fight about it and talk about it in court. And this isn't going so well for the prosecutors.
No, it's not. And I thought too, like I was kind of surprised they did take this in court. I was one of the people saying that this, like when the indictment came out against the GRU and the Internet Research Agency, and I think the deal is that Concord Management is some kind of parent company or financial backer of this Internet Research Agency. They're supposed to be somehow involved in the Russian active measures social media influence campaign or whatever. But I was, you know, surprised and proven wrong that they did take this to court, and they have been sort of pushing back against this. However, so recently in that case with Concord Management, a federal judge ruled that Mueller's team may have actually broken the law by asserting a link between the Russian government and this entity, this Concord Management. And he said because Mueller's team didn't substantiate it. It just asserted that connection, didn't prove it. And like apparently you're not allowed to do that as in an indictment or something. And so the judge's ruling, it doesn't actually refute anything that Mueller said necessarily. However, it does show that we are not the only people who are sort of seeing like the evidence is lacking, like the evidence being put forward by the Mueller team to back up some of these assertions about, you know, Russian collusion and social media influence operations and stuff. We've been sort of saying all along, like, come on, show us the proof, bring up some evidence. And that's basically what this judge said. He said that like you can't do that. You can't just assert the link with no substantiation there. And like really the social media aspect of this whole Russiagate thing is probably the most outrageous part of it. Like there's so many things about this Internet Research Agency that just, it makes no sense. Like, or it doesn't track with the narrative about them. Like between 2015 and 2017, according to Mueller, this agency only spent about $100,000 on Facebook ads or boosted posts or whatever. Only half of their $100,000 budget was spent on that. And then only a fraction of the posts that were posted on Facebook were about the U.S. election at all, or about U.S. politics. And then only half of those posts that were about politics even ran before the election, where they could make any difference. And then, of course, if you look at the actual examples of the posts, it was like, you know, on the level of like this post if Jesus is better than Hillary and stuff like that. So just, this is the organization that's supposed to have spearheaded all this stuff. This is all the nonsense evidence they've put forward to sort of prove that. And now I think this judge's ruling has sort of thrown some cold water on that idea.
Yeah, so I guess, we continue to move in the direction that me and you started talking, about 50-something episodes ago, Will, which is this whole Russiagate thing is fake, and that there actually may be a behind-the-scenes conspiracy going on at the FBI, investigating Donald Trump. A lot of shady dealings going on within the Hillary Clinton campaign trying to justify their loss. A bunch of very foolish liberals and probably some opportunist media figures playing up on this whole Russiagate conspiracy theory, prying on the fears of the left who, just thought, the worst monster ever in history got elected as president. And, I think as time goes on, it's going to turn out to be fake. And I guess best case for us, Will, is that these investigations come out and show what actually happened behind the scenes at the FBI. But it seems like at this point, worst case scenario is it just fades off. I guess, maybe we could wrap up here just talking about there's been a lot of negative impacts, including that, the show's airing on August 2nd, and that's the day that the INF treaty dies. And so we've seen a whole bunch of negative things happen between the Trump administration and Russia, and all the negatives were cheered on by this Never Trump crowd, and all the positives, Trump meeting with Vladimir Putin, were demonized and smeared. And I guess maybe spend 5 minutes here before we wrap up talking about the real world effects and why we have focused so much time on this show on Russiagate.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I think this has very dire foreign policy consequences. The narrative about Russiagate, that the president is somehow illicitly colluding with a foreign state, and the way that they spin that is that he's Russia is a dictatorship of some sort, and they're up to all kinds of up to no good or all around the world, and so therefore Trump is colluding with that, and so I think that sort of hems him in and ties his hands on certain foreign policy decisions. I mean, he can't even really have a phone call with Vladimir Putin without having the entire media, accusing him of treason. And so, I think that's a clear way that it sort of ties his hands, but it also extends into other things too, that they've been able to parlay this Russiagate thing into other stuff, into other, into the Syria question. They're able to use the Russiagate stuff to try to attack Trump for his desire to withdraw in Syria. I think they're even able to use it to sort of attack him on the North Korea stuff, because they say, oh, look at how much Trump loves dictators. He loves Russia and Putin. And therefore that this, him trying to talk to the North Koreans is just part of that whole thing. And so this narrative is very beneficial to, I think, the war hawks, the people who want to see continued hostility and conflict with all these quote unquote U.S. adversaries around the world. And most worryingly, I think, is with Russia, because, the two largest nuclear arsenals on planet Earth, it's absolutely vital that those two countries have good diplomacy and get along. And this whole Russiagate thing has absolutely been toxic to U.S. diplomacy. And Trump has he's taken some of the bait from the Democrats. Like you said, he got out of the INF treaty. I think he's killed several arms control agreements with Russia. And I think that's partially to prove to his critics that he's not he's not beholden to Russia. Because as we know, Trump ran on a platform of wanting to get along with Putin and wanting to improve relations with Russia. And clearly this whole narrative against him has sort of frozen that initiative.
Yeah, well, I mean, the big deal now with the arms control treaty is the New START treaty, which needs to be extended by February 2021. And Trump put John Bolton ahead of negotiating that thing. So you could only imagine what the wrecker of nuclear deals will do to a nuclear deal. But I guess we should probably wrap up there, Will, and maybe save John Bolton as a subject for a later episode, and just tell people where they could find your work, what you've been doing, and anything else you want to plug.
Yeah, sure. So as you said at the beginning, I'm a staff writer for RT. I basically work with the web team there to build to create the news for the site. I don't really get a lot of bylines on my stories. However, you can find the stuff I'm actually writing myself on my Twitter handle, WKP ANCAP, ANCAP, and then Will Porter on Facebook, of course. And my other work can be found at Consortium News, the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and the Daily Sheeple. And I think that's it.
All right. Thank you very much, Will.
All right. Take care.